Kaneko Fumiko had a rough childhood. Born out of wedlock and left without official government registration, Fumi's opportunities were limited for her entire childhood. After being abandoned by her father at a young age, Fumi spent some of her formative years in deep poverty and witnessed the exploitation of the urban poor and rural peasantry alike in Japanese society. She seemed to finally catch a break when, at age 12, her paternal grandmother brought her to the Japanese colony of Korea to live with wealthy relatives. But instead of love and care, all she found in Korea was abuse and exploitation, both in her own household and the colonial society as a whole. These experiences shaped Fumi, filling her with a sense of resentment both for her own treatment and for the rot she saw at the core of Taisho Japan. But they also filled her with a thirst for knowledge, a desire to reclaim her agency in the one way she knew how, by learning everything she could about the world that oppressed her. These experiences and studies would shape Fumiko's own unique philosophy, and ultimately bring her to a grave fate in a prison cell. But first, Fumiko would need to return to Japan. This is my third video on Kaneko Fumiko. You should be up to speed after that intro, but if you'd like to learn more about Fumi's childhood, you can find a link to the other episodes in the description below. In 1919, Fumiko boarded a ship back to Japan. Although her grandmother was sending her back simply to avoid having to arrange a marriage for the 16-year-old Fumiko, Fumi was simply relieved to be free of the family that had abused her for the previous 4 years. Yet, while she would no longer be subject to the constant verbal and physical abuse that had once driven her to plan suicide in Korea, what awaited Fumiko in Japan wouldn't be a cakewalk either. She at first returned to her mother's village. However, Fumiko soon became fed up with her mother's family, who constantly bickered amongst themselves and frustrated Fumiko's intellectual desires. Shortly afterwards, Fumiko's estranged father arrived to reconnect with her, and for a time she moved into his household. However, Fumi's life there was made uncomfortable as her father insisted that she participate in daily rituals honoring his ancestors, the Psyches. As an unregistered child, she had never been able to use the Psyche name, and on top of that, she perceived her father's beliefs as mere superstition. As such, Fumi had a hard time mustering any sincere respect for her ancestors, and loathed to bow before them, feigning feelings she didn't hold in her heart. Her relationship with her father was further strained by his choice to arrange a marriage between Fumiko and her own uncle, a corrupt priest who offered him access to the wealth of his temple. While uncle-niece marriages weren't unheard of in Japan at the time, and Fumi got on well with her uncle, she was deeply disturbed by her father's choice to, in her words, sell her just like an object to her uncle. Despite carrying on relationships with multiple other women himself, Fumi's uncle called off this arrangement after learning that Fumiko had exchanged romantic letters with a boy, claiming that the possible loss of her virginity invalidated his agreement with her father. Fumi's father reacted violently towards Fumi, and Fumi would describe their relationship from then on as being one of virtual enemies. After Fumi's father had another violent outburst in response to her criticizing his pridefulness, Fumiko decided she could no longer stand to live with him. And so, at age 17, Fumi left her father's household, and, with only 10 yen in her pocket, set out to create a life of her own in Tokyo. When she arrived in Tokyo, Fumiko set out with plans to study English, mathematics, and classical Chinese, hoping ultimately to pass the entrance exam to study as a doctor. She initially moved in with a maternal great-uncle, but grew frustrated as he continuously advised her to give up on education and focus on cultivating skills to attract a husband and marrying rich. She saw an advertisement calling for desperate students to work as newspaper sellers, and, being a desperate student, promptly applied. Through this job, she secured enough money to pay for school, lodging, and food. The job also exposed her to Christian and socialist groups, who would sometimes gather to give sidewalk sermons or speeches in the same area where Fumi sold papers. However, the work was hard, with Fumi having to stay on her feet from 4 p.m. to midnight in all weather conditions, calling out to attract customers until her throat was hoarse. Since she was up so late, Fumi would regularly end up falling asleep in her classes. Moreover, by the end of each shift, she was covered in sweat and grime, but the public baths would be closed for the night. Although her manager presented himself as saving students, Fumi would come to realize that he was getting more out of the workers than they were getting from him, taking the lion's share of the profit while they did the hard work. She moved on to other jobs, working as a street vendor and a maid, but ultimately found that as a worker she was exploited regardless of occupation or employer. Fumiko converted to Christianity for a time, becoming a die-hard believer during her most difficult times. She attended church services each Sunday and would wake up early in the morning and clean the toilet for her landlord, asking nothing in return in the name of Christian charity. And yet, for all that her friends in the Salvation Army told her that this faith would pay off, she didn't have enough money to even buy food. Looking back at this period later, Fumiko asked herself if Christian teachings were just something to anesthetize people's hearts, to numb them to the pains of the world, a sort of opiate for the masses, if you will. Fumiko would later become friends with several socialists who attended school with her, including a number of Koreans, who Fumi felt a special solidarity with since her time in Korea. Fumi would describe socialism as offering her no new information, but providing her with theory to verify what she already knew from experience. When Fumiko was 18, she would meet two people who would significantly impact her life. The first was a fellow student at English school, Hatsuyo Niyama. Hatsuyo was one of only 4 or 5 women in Fumi's class, and the two were seated next to each other when Fumi overheard Hatsuyo discussing the topic of death with another classmate. I have a lung ailment, which is why I have thought so much about death. I believe it is not so much death itself that people fear, as the pain of that instant of passing over to death. The reason I feel this way is that people are not afraid of sleep, even though the loss of consciousness in sleep is, you could say, a kind of temporary death. Fumiko disagreed with Hatsuyo's stance and jumped in to share her own perspective. Hearing this, I vividly recalled the feelings I had experienced the time in Korea that I had determined to die. I joined the conversation to say that, based on my own experience, I thought Hatsuyo's view was mistaken. I don't agree with you. I can state from my own experience that what people fear in death is the loneliness of having to leave this world forever. Though people may not be consciously aware of all the phenomena around them under normal circumstances, the thought that that which makes them themselves will be lost forever is a terribly lonely thing. In sleep, that which is ourselves is not lost, merely forgotten. While on reflection, Fumi would say she no longer believed that either of them were fully correct. The discussion is what prompted her to grow closer to Hatsuyo, who would go on to introduce Fumiko to some of her greatest influences. Hatsuyo shared books by a number of thinkers Fumi would describe as nihilists, with Friedrich Nietzsche, Max Stirner, and Mikhail Artsebachev being among the most influential on the development of Fumi's own thinking. As Fumi's thinking evolved, she began looking at her schooling differently. She had been trying so hard in her education to get ahead in life, but now began to feel that not only were her efforts in vain, but also that getting ahead wasn't really all it was chalked up to be. After all, she wrote in her memoir, is there any more worthless lot than the so-called great people of the world? What is so admirable about being looked up to by others? I do not live for others. What I had to achieve was my own freedom, my own satisfaction. I had to be myself. At the same time, despite her strong influence from socialists, Fumiko did not consider herself truly among their ranks, in part for reasons corresponding to the anarchist-Bolshevik split that was developing in Japan at this time. Socialism seeks to change society for the sake of the oppressed masses, but is what it would accomplish truly for their welfare? Socialism would create a social upheaval for the masses, and the masses would stake their lives on the struggle together with those who had risen up on their behalf. But what would the ensuing change mean for them? Power would be in the hands of the leaders, and the order of the new society would be based on that power. The masses would become slaves all over again to that power. What is revolution, then, but the replacing of one power with another? This thinking, she expressed, was influenced by Hatsuyo, who herself rejected ideas about a perfect society and simply focused on living life for herself. However, Fumiko differed from Hatsuyo in one key respect. I felt that even if one did not have an ideal vision of society, one could have one's work to do. Whether it was successful or not was not our concern. It was enough that we believed it to be a valid work. The accomplishment of that work, I believed, was what our real life was about. Yes, I wanted to carry out a work of my own, for I feel that by so doing, our lives are rooted in the here and now, not in some far-off ideal goal. Fumiko's next important meeting during this period would be with Park Yeol, a Korean individualist anarchist. She first heard his name when reading a short poem he'd published in a socialist magazine. Oh, what a powerful poem it was! Every single phrase gripped me. By the time I finished, I was practically in raptures. My heart leapt in my breast, and I felt as though my very existence had been elevated to new heights. Upon hearing his name, she insisted on learning more about him, and was told he was at that time out of work and drifting between staying with different friends, making him hard to get a hold of. Nevertheless, Fumi was determined. Something was stirring within me, about to be born. What was at work within this man? What was it that made him so strong? I wanted to find out and make it my own. I left Jong to go back to the shop, and on the way it dawned on me. That's it. That's what I'm looking for. The work that I want to do. He has it within him. He is what I'm looking for. He has my work. A strange joy set my heart leaping. Later, Fumiko encountered Park in a shop, and was able to ask him to come back to meet her. After they'd met several times, and had a very cute interaction I have to restrain myself not to excerpt in full here, Fumi very straightforwardly asked Park to date her. Well, I'll get right to the point. Do you have a wife? Or, well, if not exactly a wife, someone like, say, a lover? Because if you do, I want our relationship to just be one between comrades. Well, do you? Park accepted the offer, and he and Fumi eventually decided to move in together. The pair founded a group called the Futeisha, or Malcontent Society, mostly consisting of Koreans living in Japan, but also including some Japanese nihilists like Fumi and Hatsuyo. This organization would serve as a study group and a more direct action-oriented body within the larger Kokuyukai, or Black Friend Society, a more public-facing anarchist organization. The members of the Futeisha began developing a vague plan for a bomb attack against Prince Hirohito, somewhat similar to the plot that led to the high treason incident around a decade earlier, which you can learn more about in my video about Kano Sugako. As Fumi would later explain, the people of Japan had been told for generations that the emperor was divine, justifying his authority. The goal of this bombing, therefore, would be to shatter this fantasy, showing the emperor to be just as human as anyone else. Due to trust issues and internal squabbles between members, these plans never amounted to anything. However, the very fact that a plot had been hatched would impact what happened to Fumi next. In 1923, Tokyo was rocked by the Great Kanto earthquake. As discussed in my video on Itonoe, this incident would lead to a ton of scapegoating of Koreans, and to a lesser extent leftists. In the chaos of this event, Fumi, Park, and other members of the Futeisha found themselves rounded up by the government. In prison, Hatsuyo, struggling with physical ailments that would lead to her death 2 months later, testified that Fumi and Park had planned a bombing against the prince. Based on this testimony, the pair were convicted of harming the Japanese royal family, a capital offense. While in prison, Fumi and Park Yeol officially married. Considering how little stock Fumi and Park put into institutions, this marriage was likely intended as an ironic gesture, having the Japanese government unite them in life before uniting them in death. During her trial, Fumiko seems to have heavily played up her involvement in the bombing plot, likely hoping to ensure she shared a fate with Park. She used the trial as an opportunity to voice her philosophy and her reasons for holding it, explaining her life experiences and how they'd shaped her viewpoint. At times, Fumiko's testimony reads as a venting of frustrations. Fumi declared that the ultimate goal of her nihilist philosophy was the negation and annihilation of all life, including her own. I don't bear a grudge against my father or mother, but it is true that much of my life was spent in extreme hardship. I was cursed by it everywhere I went, and this made me want to die as I do, annihilating everything, cursing nature, cursing society, cursing all that lives. However, in a later letter to the judge who oversaw her case, Fumiko discussed a change in her thinking. Formerly I said, I negate life, but a negation of life does not originate in philosophy, for life alone is the origin of all things. Yes, my negation of all life was completely meaningless. Negation is not created from negation. The stronger the affirmation, the stronger the negation created. That is, the stronger the affirmation of life, the stronger the creation of life negation together with rebellion. Therefore, I affirm life. I affirm it strongly. And since I affirm life, I resolutely rebel against all power that coerces life. Thus, you officials might ask, then why did you pretend you were trying to destroy your own life? I would answer, living is not synonymous with merely having movement. It is moving in accordance with one's will. One could say that with deeds one begins to really live. When one moves by one's own will, and this leads to the destruction of one's body, this is not a negation of life. It is an affirmation. Ultimately, Fumiko rejected all forms of authority. Authority wielded by the family, by capitalists, by the state, and by other ideological and religious constructs, each serving to oppress people and deny them the ability to live lives as they saw fit. To Fumiko, each of these authorities rested on deception, false concepts used to create some higher-minded justification for simple oppression. The response Fumi favored, therefore, was to reject these deceptions, embracing the ego and rebelling against all authority. Do what I am motivated to do now. This is the only maxim of my action. When a person wakes up to ego, the state falls. Quite so. I deny all the orders from outside, such as state or government, but the inner order from my own. Although Fumiko was initially sentenced to death by Japan's Supreme Court, this sentence was later commuted to life in prison. However, Fumi did not accept this fate. When presented with her imperial pardon, Fumi reacted with rage, tearing the document to pieces and proclaiming, "You toy with people's lives, killing or allowing to live as it suits you. What is this special pardon? Am I to be disposed of according to your whims?" In July of 1926, Fumiko committed suicide by hanging, rejecting the pardon in the firmest possible way. At one point in her trial, she had told the judge that, while she knew she could secure her freedom by claiming to be reformed and asking forgiveness, instead of going down on my knees before power, I'd rather die and remain true to myself. In this final act of defiance, Fumiko claimed her freedom in accordance with a poem she'd previously written. One's limbs may not be free, and yet, if one has but the will to die, death is freedom. Park Yeol, whose sentence had also been commuted to life in prison, was freed in 1945 following the Japanese defeat in World War II, and returned to Korea, where Fumi's remains had previously been relocated. Fumiko and Park's story would be featured in the 2017 Korean film Anarchist from Colony, which I'd recommend checking out, it's pretty good. On November 17, 2018, the Republic of Korea awarded Fumi the posthumous Order of Merit for National Foundation for her opposition to the Japanese Empire, making her one of only 2 Japanese people to earn this award. Considering her ideological beliefs, I don't think she'd particularly appreciate getting a medal from a state, but it was nice of them to recognize her. Kaneko Fumiko lived a difficult life, but this life molded her into a remarkable woman. In her final months, Fumiko expressed a variety of emotions, including plenty of rage and resentment, but also hope, love, and optimism. For all the suffering she'd faced, by the end of her life, Fumiko felt truly free, in a way that affirmed her life. She found an understanding of purpose that didn't hinge on great social change, but on being herself and acting as she saw fit, rebelling against authority to affirm her own desires. If there's one thing we can take away from the life and philosophy of Kaneko Fumiko, it's her affirmation of life, her affirmation of sincerity, and the power of truthfulness in the face of the deceptions that justify oppression. When I started writing about Kaneko Fumiko, I didn't expect to end up with 3 videos on her life, but I was so gripped by her memoir that I struggled to trim it down into a single short video. Ultimately, even here I had to leave out a lot of details. I'd highly recommend checking out the memoir if you can, as well as my other sources, listed below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting down below to help me out in the algorithm. If you can, I'd also appreciate if you'd share this video around, as that's the best way to get new eyes on my channel. Thanks for watching everybody, I've been Silma, and I'll see you next time.